Hey guys, David Stewart here. Let's talk about fantasy. And I want to talk about one particular complaint or objection that I get to some of my criticisms of books or movies. And my criticism will go something like this. This event is impossible or implausible. And the rebuttal, the response is, well, it's a fantasy. Thus implying that the impossible is possible in a fantasy and the implausible is normal. And that's not really a valid analysis of fantasy in general. And I want to talk about that in a little bit. And one of the elements that I really want to talk about in that context is the thing called a magic system, or what I call magic systems. Commonly we think of fantasy as being about like destroying what we normally think of as reality and having something different. And therefore it's just going to be a different reality. But that's not really the way it works. Fantasy is not about breaking down limitations so much as erecting different limitations. Even when you have something like magic, you will usually have in a fantasy book a magic system. A magic system are sort of the rules of magic. It turns it more into a science and less into like something that is completely chaotic and unpredictable. So wizards have certain magic schools they might be experts at. There's certain things you could do with the Force in Star Wars, and certain things you can't do with the Force in Star Wars, right? You can't blow up a planet with the Force. You can't, you can like choke someone to death, but you may not be able to just like make their blood boil necessarily, right? So there's limitations to what you do to the magic, and that's really the important thing about a magic system. Magic system defines what you can do, how you can do it, and how you go about learning how to do it. There's too many novels to talk about with too many different magic systems, but almost all of them that have magic will have some sort of magic system. Even Tolkien, even ye old Tolkien, had magic systems in his book. In fact, he actually would state that people viewed what the elves did as magic, but they didn't view what they did as magic. For them, it was just their art, right? It was just something normal that they did, and it wasn't understood by men. So from Tolkien's perspective, magic wasn't even magic. Magic was like the power of beings that are supernatural, that we don't understand, that is within their own normal limitations. And frequently, you have characters that are godlike in Tolkien talking about their limitations. You have Gandalf who says, there are powers in this world that are greater than me, and there are some against which I've not been tested, which indicates that he has limitations. Even though he's a wizard, there are things he can't do. And those limitations are really, really, really important from a story perspective, because characters without limits are boring. Because if you have no limits, then there is no danger. Characters have to have limits so that we can feel that they are in danger, or that they have some struggle, they have some growth to do, not because of some other need that we have. It makes for good story writing, and that's why authors use magic systems. A really good example of this particular criticism happens or is ongoing on my sort of latest video on Star Wars. There's always this objection, Star Wars is a fantasy. And I actually do consider Star Wars a fantasy. Some people consider Star Wars fantasy, or sci-fi. I consider it a high fantasy with sci-fi elements. And that's because we have a magic system called the Force. We have a different galaxy. Our world is not part of that galaxy. It's a galaxy far, far away. So it's a new world. It's like a high fantasy, like Tolkien-like high fantasy, but in space. And we have all sorts of technology that isn't really fully explained. We understand that it's technological, but we don't really know how it works. Whereas hard sci-fi, you'd have a little bit more explanation of how technology happens to work. That's just... I know that's not like a really good definition of the difference between soft sci-fi and hard sci-fi, but, So, Star Wars I do consider it a fantasy with some sci-fi elements. Well, because it's a fantasy, in order for us to believe that the characters have struggles and limitations, we have to create a magic system. And the magic system for the Force is defined in the original movies and in the trilogy that follows up on that. It's defined in all these other books about like what you can do with the Force, how the Force works. There's midichlorians, which people are not super excited about, but whatever, that was Lucas's imagination for that. So we have all these sort of boundaries for like what the Force does and what it can't do, and who can use the Force and who can't use the Force. And when someone breaks out of these limitations and it's not really explained, that breaks the immersion, because all of a sudden a viewer understands that without the limitations, this person's never really in any kind of particular danger. Like we all of a sudden no longer care about their struggle because there is no struggle. A really good example of how you can avoid this problem, right? Because like in Force Awakens, Rey just does all these like fantastic force skills without ever having trained them. At least we don't see her training them in the movie. People have said, well, maybe she was trained before. And it's like, yeah, there's all these great fan theories and I love them, but they're not part of the movie, so they don't really count in terms of how they explain what Rey does. So anyway, a really good example of how to avoid that is actually a really, really popular Brandon Sanderson book called Way of Kings. And if you haven't read it, and most serious fantasy fans will probably have read Brandon Sanderson before. And Way of Kings is probably his, I don't know if it's his most popular book, but it's a very famous book. And I actually think it's a very good book. I didn't like the follow-up as much, but anyway. In the very beginning of the book, there's this scene where you have this assassin running through this castle. And it's sort of from his perspective, and it's talk about the magic that he's using. So he uses what are called lashings. Like he lashes himself to the ceiling and he goes like, running on the ceiling. And people are like, whoa, what's going on? Right? And then he lashes other people to like the wall and they go flying off onto the wall. And then he like lashes two objects together and they like, the tables all go up to the ceiling. And so he talks about the things that he can do. And the things he can't do, he can lash himself to different things, so he can sort of like fly up in the air a little bit, which is, from his perspective, falling upwards, not actually flying. But he talks about all the things that he can do, but there's things he can't do. Like he encounters the person he's supposed to kill. He doesn't just like explode them with his mind. He has to fight them with his sword and try to kill them. And he does kill them. And that scene is super, super important because, first of all, it creates part of the fantasy setting right away. We have this idea, okay, there's like castles, there's people in armor, there's these magical swords they have, there's magic, here's how the magic's working, and we understand that this character is really powerful because people are like dumbfounded by how he's doing this. So it creates an expectation in the reader's mind that these are the limits of the magic system. Like, this is what you can do with magic. And then we don't see magic for quite a long time. And what happens is other characters develop their magic. They develop their magic skills. And they develop some of the same magic skills as this guy from the beginning. What that really is important, the reason that scene is important is because later on, when we see that happening, we don't lose our immersion. We don't go, wait, why is Kaladin flying up in the sky? Well, we know that certain things are possible, and he's acting within those realms of possibility, and he's not exceeding them. It doesn't break our immersion. And some people say suspension of disbelief, but I don't like that word. I'm going to use immersion, or not. I don't like that phrase. I'm going to use immersion. Immersion, I think, is a better word than suspension of disbelief, because suspension of disbelief implies that you would disbelieve, right? You want to be convinced. You want to be immersed. You want to believe that the world, that not so much that people can fly, but that in this world they could fly. That's what's important. So magic systems are in all kinds of books. There's another really, really popular book, Name of the Wind. Name of the Wind has a very limited, defined magic system. The magic system works by like saying the name of the wind, and then you at the beginning scene he says the name of the wind, and it freezes the air in his lungs, and it's a whole thing. So Earthsea has a magic system. Tolkien really has a magic system, though most people would say he doesn't. I think it's there. It's just not super brought up because honestly, other than Gandalf, none of the main characters have magic. Really, they're just what they are. There's dwarf and hobbits. That's the magical part. So a fantasy setting in terms of magic, it's about creating and defining different limits. Those different limits change what's possible for the character. And by changing what's possible for the character, you change their possible actions. By changing their possible actions, you change the trajectory of the plot. You create a story that's unique and interesting and cannot be told in a normal, modern, everyday sort of setting. It just can't be told. You couldn't tell Star Wars in 20th century New York, right? You need people with force wielders. You need people with force powers in order to have these particular conflicts. You know, you couldn't just have guys fighting with swords in the 15th century and have Star Wars, because the whole idea of this force power, it drives the plot forward. It really drives, especially the original trilogy, it drives it towards its, both trilogies. It drives them towards their ending. You are having a conflict between magic users that's over like good and evil and the nature of their magic. And without the Force, Star Wars would be much less of a movie without their magic system. But it's still a magic system. So when I say, hey, this is impossible or implausible, well, I'm saying it's impossible or implausible because there's been 6 other movies and like 50 other books that have said, here's the limits. And then when you step outside those limits and you come in from, and you just destroy them, well, it breaks the immersion. The other thing I'll say is that in this limit called the magic system, you have a box, that only controls the people who are part of that magic system, right? That only extends the possibilities of those people who are in the magic system. So yes, Luke Skywalker can do flips. He can jump super high because he has force powers. Yoda can pick up small starships out of swamps because of his force power. You know, the Emperor can shoot lightning out of his fingers. All that sort of stuff, right? But for non-force users, what about them? Well, because they're outside of the magic system, they're still bounded by the rules that you are normally associated with, right? The rules that you're used to, the rules of physics that bind all of us. Han Solo doesn't go doing crazy backflips. He doesn't shoot rainbows out of his butt, and he doesn't force choke people because he's not a force user. Certainly he doesn't just sprout wings and fly away. That would be, if that were to happen in a Star Wars movie, we'd consider it completely implausible because there's no reason for Han Solo to do that. He's a normal guy and is therefore bounded by the expectations that we normally have. The normal way that physical worlds are supposed to work. And that happens in Way of Kings. The world sort of works in a physical way that is appropriate. Although he has like fantastic ideas like grass that pulls itself under the rocks to like avoid being crushed. But that in that case, it's like an adaptation to this strange environment he's created. Everything logically fits together. So a good fantasy universe, everything logically fits together. The magic system, it works a particular way that the author defines, and it also has limits to what it is. It's not interesting to watch characters that are gods. Also, let's talk about one more fantasy setting, which is like superhero movies. Superheroes usually have particular powers and particular weaknesses. That's their limitations. Even Superman, who I think is a bad superhero only because his limits are so far out that it's really hard to view him as being in danger. Like his failure state in the story is not him dying, it's innocent people dying, which is a different kind of story that I think can be interesting. But even he has a weakness. Even he could be killed by kryptonite potentially. So there is still limitations to him. He also can't, just like magically teleport across the earth and like mind explode somebody. Superman's powers are defined. So in any magic system, and that is kind of a magic system, X-Men has a magic system. Each character has their limits, and they don't extend beyond those limits without some sort of very specific explanation of that happening. And I'll give another example that's coming to mind, which is The Matrix. The Matrix is, I don't know if I would classify it necessarily as a fantasy, but let's talk about this idea of a magic system, because while Neo is in the Matrix, he essentially can perform magic. So while he's in the Matrix, there's a magic system. The magic system is, hey, I have this like expansive mind and I can control this fake reality. And as soon as you do that, and you're like, wait, he's just in a simulation. There's no danger there. Well, we have to create some limits in order to keep the tension of the story going. So Morpheus says, when you get hurt in here, it hurts in the real world. Your mind makes it real. Now, normally we would say, like, your mind doesn't make dreams real, but that's a really important idea to put into the viewer's mind because we have to keep the limitations of the characters sound so that we can feel that they're in danger. There can be tension in the story. That's really what's important. So that's my big, long rebuttal to that. Remember, fantasy is not about destroying possibilities. It's about creating different possibilities. And you create those different possibilities to change the way that plots work and change their trajectory and change what's possible, change characters' perspectives, all that sort of stuff. That's the virtue of fantasy. That's why fantasy is so original. It's not original and interesting because there's Death Stars. It's original and interesting because characters act, feel, and think differently as a result of different limitations. And that's what I think is the real virtue of fantasy. So thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Check out my websites, davidvstewart.com. That mostly has like my music stuff organized. If you want to read my books or my stories, that's ddspress.com. That's my fiction website. You can read at least 2 books up there for free, including my samurai novel, which I am rather proud of. So have a good one, and thanks so much for watching.